The bell above the door of the midnight griddle gave a tired, metallic jingle. It was a sound that had greeted the late-night crowd for decades, the shift workers, the heartbroken, the insomniacs, and now, a group of young men who seemed to suck all the quiet out of the room the moment they stepped inside. At the center of them was a young man, maybe 22 years old. He moved with a kind of swagger that said he owned every space he walked into, even if he didn't. He was dressed in expensive, casual clothes. A soft-looking sweater and dark jeans that probably cost more than the weekly grocery bill for the family in the corner booth. His watch was a heavy, complicated piece of metal and glass on his wrist that caught the fluorescent light every time he gestured. And he gestured a lot. He led his three friends to a large corner booth, sliding in like he was claiming a throne. His laughter was loud and sharp, a sound that didn't invite you to join in but rather commanded you to listen. His friends, eager and laughing a little too hard at his jokes, were his audience. They were there to watch the show. The show, it turned out, was a performance of pure chaos. A young server, a woman with tired eyes, approached with menus. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you all off with some drinks?" The young man didn't look at her. He was scanning the laminated menu as if it had personally offended him. "What kind of Coke do you have?" he asked, his voice dripping with a fake curiosity. "It's just Coca-Cola, sir," she replied, her pen poised over her notepad. "Is it the kind with real sugar? Or that cheap high-fructose corn syrup garbage?" he asked, finally looking up at her with a raised eyebrow. I believe it's the standard kind, sir." He sighed, a long, dramatic sound. "Unbelievable, fine. Bring me a water bottled, not from the tap. And make sure the bottle is sealed when you bring it to the table." He tossed his menu onto the table. "And we need more time to order." "You should have known that." The server just nodded, her smile tight, and retreated. This was only the beginning. For the next hour, the corner booth was a storm cloud in the middle of the calm diner. When the food arrived, the young man became a food critic for a magazine that didn't exist. His burger was overdone to a crisp. He sent it back, demanding a new one. Cooked properly this time. His friend's fries were soggy and pathetic. He snapped his fingers to get attention, a sharp, rude sound that made people at other tables flinch. He dropped his fork on the floor with a loud clatter, and then stared at it, waiting for someone to rush over and pick it up for him. His conversation was a loud mix of name-dropping and stories about parties, luxury cars, and vacations on private islands. It was all meant to be overheard. It was all meant to impress and intimidate. He was building a wall of noise and entitlement around his table, and his friends were the willing bricks in that wall, laughing and egging him on. The other people in the diner reacted in different ways. The elderly couple a few booths away exchanged weary glances and ate a little faster. The truck driver at the counter, a big man with quiet eyes, just shook his head slowly, a low simmer of disapproval. A family with a small child asked for their pie to be boxed up to go. The atmosphere in the diner, once warm with the smell of coffee and frying onions, had turned tense and uncomfortable. Through it all, one man moved with a quiet, steady purpose. He was an older server, with a calm face and watchful eyes that had seen every kind of person come through these doors. He didn't scowl at the noisy table. He didn't avoid them. He just did his job, moving from table to table, refilling coffee cups with a gentle pour, clearing plates with a quiet efficiency. He checked on the young server who was dealing with the difficult table. "You doing okay?" he asked, his voice low. She gave a frustrated shrug. "I don't know what his problem is. He's just impossible." The older server nodded slowly. He had been watching the young man in the corner not just as a nuisance but as a person. He saw the way the young man's eyes darted around after making a scene, as if checking to see who was watching. He saw that the loud laughter didn't quite reach his eyes. He saw a performance, an act put on for an audience of his friends, and he sensed that underneath all the bluster and noise, there was something else, something restless and unhappy. While the young man in the corner was the storm, this server was the deep, calm water. He knew that shouting at a storm does nothing. You have to understand it, wait for it to pass, or find a way to calm its core. He finished wiping down a nearby table, his movements slow and deliberate. He was patient. He was waiting for the right moment, the one crack in the noisy armor, where a little bit of quiet kindness might actually find its way in. While the noise from the corner booth rolled through the diner like thunder, One man was an island of quiet. He was the older server, the one with hands that knew the weight of a full tray and eyes that missed nothing. For him, this wasn't just a job. It was a front-row seat to the theater of human life. He had seen it all: first dates, breakup tears, tired celebrations, and quiet loneliness. He understood people, often better than they understood themselves. As he moved between the red vinyl booths and the Formica countertops, his presence was a gentle calm. He didn't rush. His walk was a steady, unhurried pace that seemed to say, "Everything will get done in its own time." When he poured coffee for the truck driver at the counter, he did it with a smooth, practiced motion, not spilling a single drop. He'd place the pot back on the warmer with a soft click, not a slam. His attention, though he never stared, kept drifting back to the storm in the corner. He wasn't watching the young man with anger or even annoyance. He was watching him the way a gardener watches the sky, reading the signs. He saw the way the rich young man would laugh a little too loudly at his own joke. Then his eyes would quickly scan the room to see who had heard him. He saw how the young man's shoulders were always tense, raised up near his ears even when he was slouching in the booth. This wasn't just someone being rude. This was someone performing, putting on a big loud show for his friends and for everyone else in the room. The other staff members were feeling the pressure. The young waitress who was serving the table looked close to tears, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly as she tried to carry a plate of pancakes to another family. The cook in the kitchen had started grumbling louder, the sound of his spatula hitting the grill becoming more forceful. The manager was peeking out from the small office, his face tight with worry, probably calculating if he should risk asking the difficult table to leave. The older server saw all this happening. He caught the young waitress's eye as she passed him, carrying a heavy load of dirty dishes. He gave her a small, almost invisible nod. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was enough. It said, "I see you. You're doing fine. This will pass." She took a slow, deep breath and her shoulders relaxed just a little. He then walked over to the window into the kitchen. He leaned his head in and spoke to the cook in a low, steady voice. "Hey, those onion rings for table 5 almost ready? They smell amazing." He wasn't really asking about the onion rings. He was distracting the cook, pulling his focus away from the anger and back to the food. The cook grunted but then turned back to his fryer with a slightly less angry posture. This was his way. He was a fixer, not a fighter. He didn't believe in meeting a loud noise with another loud noise. That only created more noise. He believed in quiet. He believed in listening. Over the years, he had learned that the people who made the biggest fuss were often the ones carrying the heaviest, quietest hurt inside. They shouted on the outside because they felt small on the inside. They demanded service because they felt unseen. They created chaos because their own world felt out of control. He finished clearing a nearby table, wiping the surface clean with a damp cloth. He could hear the young man in the corner complaining about the ice in his water being the wrong shape. The older server almost smiled to himself. It was such a silly, meaningless thing to be angry about. It confirmed what he was thinking. This wasn't about the ice. This wasn't about the burger. This was about something else entirely. He decided then that he would take over the table, not because he wanted to, but because he knew the young waitress had reached her limit. He walked over to the manager, who was still watching the scene with a nervous expression. "I've got that table," the older server said, his voice calm and low. "Don't worry about it." The manager looked at him with relief and worry mixed together on his face. "Are you sure?" "That kid is a handful," the older server just nodded. "I'm sure. It's okay." He didn't march over to the table right away. He didn't put on a fake smile or prepare a speech. He just went back to his work, refilling sugar shakers, straightening the napkin holders. He was giving the young man a little more rope. He was waiting. He was watching for the real moment, the crack in the performance. He knew it would come. It always did. When a person is putting on an act that big, they eventually get tired. They slip up. And in that single, unguarded moment, the real person inside peeks out. That was the moment he was waiting for. The moment when a quiet word spoken with kindness and without judgment could do what all the arguing and scowling in the world could not. It could actually be heard. He took a deep breath and got ready, not for a battle but for a conversation. The moment came as the older server knew it would. It didn't arrive with a bang but with a snap. The young man in the corner had finished his meal, or at least he had finished pushing the food around his plate until it looked like a wreck. He decided it was time for dessert. He waved a hand in the air, his fingers clicking together impatiently. The young waitress, who was now carrying a hot pot of coffee towards another table, saw him but needed a moment to safely put the pot down. A moment was too long for him. He snapped his fingers. Not just a little tap. It was a sharp cracking sound like a dry twig breaking. He snapped them right in the air near her face as she finally approached the table. She flinched. It was a small, quick movement, a duck of her head and a blink of her eyes, but everyone nearby saw it. The hot coffee sloshed dangerously inside the pot she was still holding, nearly spilling over. Her face, already tired, flushed a deep red with a mix of shock and embarrassment. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. The low hum of conversation died completely. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The truck driver at the counter stopped eating, his fork halfway to his mouth. The elderly couple stared, their mouths open slightly. This was different from the loud complaints and the entitled demands. This was a direct personal insult. It was a line being crossed. The young man's friends looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. One of them started to say, "Hey man, maybe don't..." But the young man cut him off, his eyes blazing with a kind of triumphant anger. He was the center of attention, and in his mind that meant he was winning. "What?" he said, his voice loud in the quiet room, directed at the waitress. "Is it too hard to do your job? Do I need to find someone who isn't completely useless?" The young waitress looked down at her shoes, her lips pressed tightly together. She was trying not to cry. The manager, who had just come out of the office, took a step forward, his face pale. He was about to speak, to try and calm the situation, but he was too slow. The older server was already moving. He didn't rush. He didn't storm over. He placed the cloth he had been holding onto the counter and walked with that same steady pace across the checkered floor. He didn't look at the flustered waitress or the angry manager. His eyes were fixed on the young man. He didn't stand over the table to intimidate him. Instead, he did something unexpected. He moved to the side of the booth and bent down a little, so that he was closer to the young man's eye level. He didn't bring a notepad. He didn't have a fake smile on his face. His expression was calm, serious, but not unkind. He didn't raise his voice. In fact, he spoke so quietly that only the young man and his friends could hear him. The rest of the diner could only watch the silent scene, wondering what was being said. He looked directly at the young man, whose face was still twisted in a scowl, ready for a fight. But the older server didn't give him a fight. He gave him a question. "Hey," he said, his voice low and steady like the deep rumble of a distant train. It wasn't a greeting. It was an invitation to listen. The young man was taken aback. He had been prepared for an argument, for a manager to threaten him, for someone to yell. He was not prepared for this quiet, direct address. The older server continued, his tone not accusing but genuinely curious. "It was the tone you might use to ask a friend who seemed troubled what was wrong. You seem like you're carrying a real heavy weight tonight," he said. The words were simple, but they landed in the space between them with a surprising weight. "Everything okay?" For a long second there was no sound. The young man just stared at him. The anger on his face seemed to freeze, then it began to crack. You could see it happening. The bluster, the pride, the performance, it all started to dissolve under the gentle, unexpected pressure of that simple question. The young man's mouth, which had been open to fire back another rude comment, slowly closed. His eyes, which had been blazing with a fake fire, darted away for a moment, looking at the table, at his hands, anywhere but at the calm, knowing eyes of the server. He looked confused, as if he had been running full speed and someone had suddenly stepped in his path. Not to shove him, but to simply ask where he was running to in such a hurry. The words heavy weight seemed to echo in the air. They were the exact opposite of everything the young man had been projecting all night. He had been trying to show he was light, carefree, powerful, and above it all. This server had looked right through all of that and had seen the truth, that he was burdened, that he was struggling. His friends were completely silent, watching him, waiting to see how he would react. The whole diner was waiting. The young man's shoulders, which had been tense and high for so long, suddenly slumped. The fight went out of him all at once. He looked for the first time that night like what he truly was, a young man, tired and maybe a little lost. He looked back at the older server, and the anger was gone from his eyes. It was replaced by something else, shame and a flicker of surprise. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked down at his hands again and muttered two words, so quiet they were almost inaudible. It's fine. Sorry. The apology hung in the air, a small, fragile thing in the quiet diner. The storm was over. The silence in the diner felt heavy and full, like the air after a thunderstorm has finally passed. For a long moment, nobody moved. The young man's friends stared at him, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. They were waiting for the old version of their friend to come back, the loud, commanding one who snapped his fingers and made demands. But that person was gone. The young man himself wouldn't look up from the table. He stared at the smears of ketchup and the crumpled napkin on his plate as if he were seeing them for the first time. His cheeks were flushed with a hot, deep redness that had nothing to do with anger. It was the burn of pure shame. The older server's words, a real heavy weight, echoed in his mind. It was as if the server had reached right through all the noise and seen the secret he'd been trying to hide all night, maybe for much longer. The older server didn't move away. He didn't accept the mumbled apology and rush off, making the moment feel awkward. He also didn't press for more. He simply stayed there, bent slightly at the side of the booth, a quiet and patient presence. He was giving the young man space to feel what he was feeling, without judgment. It was a rare kind of kindness, one that asked for nothing in return. Finally, the young man took a shaky breath. He still couldn't meet the server's eyes, but he spoke again, his voice a little clearer. "We'll just take the check, please." The older server simply nodded. "Of course. I'll get that for you right away." He straightened up and walked back towards the service counter, his movements as calm and unrushed as ever. The spell was broken. The low murmur of conversation slowly started up again in the diner, but it was different now. The tension was gone. The elderly couple went back to their pie, talking in soft whispers. The truck driver finally took the bite of food that had been waiting on his fork, giving a slow, approving nod to no one in particular. At the corner booth, the mood had completely changed. The young man's friends were quiet, unsure of what to say or do. One of them tried to make a joke, a weak attempt to bring back the old feeling. "Well, that was otter," he started, but the young man cut him off with a sharp look. The joke died before it was born. There was no more performance left in him. The audience was gone and he felt exposed. The older server returned with the black plastic folder holding the bill. He placed it gently on the table in the center of the booth. "Whenever you're ready," he said, his tone neutral and professional, not friendly but not cold. He wasn't trying to be his friend. He was just doing his job with a quiet dignity that made the young man feel even smaller. The young man didn't make a show of pulling out a fancy credit card. He didn't complain about the price. He quickly pulled a few bills from his wallet, tucked them inside the folder, and slid out of the booth. "Let's go," he said to his friends, his voice low. His friends scrambled to follow him. The walk to the door felt very long. The young man was intensely aware of every person in the diner, sure they were all watching him, judging him. The bell above the door jingled as they left, and this time, the sound seemed to signal an escape. Outside in the cool night air, the young man stopped and took a deep breath. His friends stood around him awkwardly. "Are you okay, man?" one of them asked. "Yeah, fine," the young man said, but his voice was hollow. He felt stripped bare. The server's question was still ringing in his ears. "Everything okay?" No, nothing was okay. The pressure from his father to take over the business, the loneliness of a life where he never knew if people liked him for himself or his money, the constant feeling that he was never good enough. It all came crashing down on him in that moment. The chaos in the diner hadn't been power. It had been a cry for help that he himself hadn't even understood. He started walking towards his expensive car, but he didn't feel powerful sitting in it. He just felt empty. He had spent the whole night trying to feel big and important, and it had taken one quiet man with a simple question to show him how small he had really been acting. He knew an apology to the waitress wasn't enough. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. He needed to do something more. He needed to prove mostly to himself that he had understood the lesson of the night, that he could be better. As he drove away, the bright lights of the city blurring past his window, a plan began to form in his mind. It wasn't a grand, dramatic plan. It was something quiet. Something simple. Something that would meet that same quiet dignity he had been shown with a little dignity of his own. A week passed. Life at the diner returned to its normal rhythm. The story of the rude rich kid and the quiet server became a piece of kitchen lore, something the staff would mention sometimes on a slow night. The older server went about his work just the same as always. He didn't talk about what he had done. To him, it wasn't a big victory. It was just another moment of trying to understand another person. He had already let it go. It was a Tuesday evening, quiet and calm. The dinner rush was over, and the late-night coffee drinkers hadn't yet arrived. The older server was wiping down the counter, making slow circular motions with his cloth. The bell above the door jingled. He looked up. And there he was. The young man, he was alone this time. He stood by the door for a second as if he needed a moment to gather his courage. He was dressed more simply in a plain jacket and jeans. He looked different. The loud, puffed-up confidence was gone. In its place was a kind of nervous stillness. He looked like someone who had something important to say and was afraid of saying it. He saw the older server and walked directly towards him. He didn't swagger. His steps were careful and deliberate. The older server stopped wiping the counter. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. His face was open, waiting to see what would happen. The young waitress from the other night saw him from across the room and her eyes went wide. She moved a little closer to the kitchen just in case. The young man reached the counter. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets. "Hi," he said. His voice was quiet. "Hello," the older server replied. "What can I get for you?" The young man shook his head. "I'm not here to eat." He paused, gathering his words. I wanted to thank you for what you said to me last week." The older server gave a small, slow nod. "You're welcome. It meant something to me." The young man continued, his words coming out in a bit of a rush now. "What you ask me? Nobody ever asks that." He pulled an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. It was a plain white envelope, not flashy. He placed it on the counter between them. "This is for you," he said. "It's a tip. For your service." The older server looked at the envelope. He knew it wasn't just a tip. It was an apology, a thank you, and an attempt to make things right, all folded into one. He didn't pick it up right away. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." The young man said quickly, "I wanted to." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "And there's something else." He paused, looking more nervous than he had all night. "The other night, when I was leaving, I heard you talking to one of the other waiters. You were saying something about a dream you had, to start a counseling service one day, to help people." The older server was surprised. He remembered that conversation. It was just a quiet talk about a far-off dream, something he thought about during his breaks. He never thought anyone else was listening. The young man continued. "Under the envelope, there's a card, my card. I wrote my number on the back." He took a deep breath. "If you're ever serious about that, if you need any help to get it started, let me know. No strings attached. I mean it." He looked the older server directly in the eyes for the first time. There was no pride there, no sense of doing a favor. There was only a sincere, hopeful respect. Then he gave another small nod, turned around, and walked out of the diner. The bell jingled softly behind him. The older server stood there for a moment, looking at the empty space where the young man had been. Then he looked down at the envelope on the counter. He picked it up. It was thicker than a normal tip. He opened the flap and looked inside. There was a generous amount of money inside, enough to be helpful, but not so much that it felt like a show-off move. It was thoughtful, and underneath the money, just as the young man had said, was a simple, expensive-looking business card. The older server turned it over. On the back, written in clear, neat handwriting, was a phone number. And above the number, 4 words, "Let me know." No strings, the older server smiled. It was a small, gentle smile that touched the corners of his eyes. This wasn't a story about a bad person becoming a saint overnight. He knew life wasn't that simple. The young man would probably still be rude sometimes. He would still get angry. He had a long road ahead of him, but this was a beginning. It was a first small step on a new path. The quiet question in the noisy diner had planted a seed, and the young man, in his own awkward way, was trying to water it. The older server slipped the envelope into his pocket. He picked up his cloth and went back to wiping the counter. The diner was quiet. The coffee machine hissed softly. Outside, the city lights began to twinkle in the growing darkness. It was just another night, but for 2 people, in a small way, the world felt a little lighter and a little more kind.